All right, welcome back to the Introduction to Web Dev quiz series. This is the Introduction to Web Dev quiz number 2. In it, we're going to be talking about JavaScript, event listeners, innerHTML, this, and anonymous functions. And just like the last quiz, we're going to follow that same format where I go over the question. You can pause the video if you want to think about it, and then I'll go over the answer. So let's go ahead and get started. First question is, modifying the style properties of an element directly is A, okay as long as it's a dynamic style, or B, not okay ever, we should always use classes. And the answer is A. Yeah, so when I talk about modifying the style properties of an element directly, what I mean is accessing the style property within JavaScript and then setting it. So here's an example of that where we're grabbing this element with the ID box, we're setting that style, and specifically we're setting the border color. In general, when we're doing this, we want to separate out our JavaScript and our CSS. So we might want to, let's say if we had some sort of class, red, and we wanted to set the border color to be red. Instead of, doing ID box.style border color equals red, instead we would just add this class to the class list, right? And this sort of separates our JavaScript and CSS, which is, we don't want to be constantly accessing style within our JavaScript because we might have multiple of these statements, and it's really much easier to add a class. But an example that I could think of where, we actually do want to set the style of an element is this one where we have this, this div, we've got this box, and we've got this button that if you press, it changes the border color of the div to some random color. So let's say we press that button, and let's say it turns it like blue, we press that button again, it turns it to this purple, etc., etc., and in this scenario, we have this function getRandomColor that returns some sort of random hex code. So, if we wanted to create a class for every single color that exists, that would be insane. Our CSS file would look crazy. We would have to be like, okay, blue, green, purple. We'd have to create all these CSS classes. But so here's an example where we can set it directly in JavaScript, but only if it's this dynamic property, this dynamic attribute. All right, next question. What happens if I try to remove a class from an element that doesn't have that class? A, an error in the console appears. B, nothing happens. Or C, that element is removed from the HTML. The answer is B. Yeah, so this might be a little bit surprising, but if you go to the MDN web docs, which is a really good resource for web development, and you go to the wiki page for remove, you can see it's got the syntax parameters, and it's got a little description at the bottom. If the string is not in the list, no error is thrown and nothing happens, right? So assuming we have some element has some class list, let's say it has class 1, class 2, so on and so forth, and we try to remove some class that it does not have. Kind of lazy naming on my part, but whatever. It's just an example. It's just not going to do anything. It's not going to throw an error. It's not going to remove the element from the HTML. It's just going to say, well, I don't have that class, so I'm not going to do anything. It's kind of a relaxed method. Right, next question. Which of the following does useStrict not do? A, shows an error if you try to assign to an undeclared variable. B, stops you from overriding key reserved variables. C, forbids some unsafe or error-prone language features. Or D, stops you from creating local variables. The answer is D, right? So local variables are actually very, very useful in JavaScript, and it would be pretty awful if useStrict stopped you from creating them, right? And what I mean when I say useStrict is we can pop this at the top of our JavaScript files, and it's going to make it so that we don't enter what's called sloppy mode, where the syntax is allowed to be a bit more sloppy, right? useStrict is kind of like if you're bowling and they let you put up those guardrails so that the ball doesn't go off the rails, right? This can be really helpful for web developers who are just dipping their toes into JavaScript, right? Because, here's 3 things that it does, A, B, and C, and I'll go one by one of them. Shows an error if you try to assign to an undeclared variable. So if you were to declare this variable, let sum variable, where sum is spelled S-O-M-E, it's going to be like, okay, cool, I have some variable declared. I know about it. JavaScript knows about it. Then let's say that we try to set the value of some variable where sum is spelled S-U-M. It's going to say, wait. Some variable, I don't know what that is. Okay, you haven't created that yet. You haven't declared it yet. So it's going to throw an error when you try to set it. This can be really helpful because if useStrict is not enabled here, what it's going to do is it's going to create some variable, and then it's also going to create this global variable, some variable, and set it to 42. So not only is this variable not have the value of 42, that you've got some sort of random global variable now that has a value of 42. It's kind of a nightmare. All right, B stops you from overwriting key reserved variables. Yeah, so you might notice that undefined might show up in a different color in whatever editor you use for JavaScript. And the reason why it's reserved, right? It's reserved because it means something in JavaScript, and useStrict will not allow you to set that value to something else. So it'll throw a type error, it'll complain at you, it'll be for good reason because you don't want to be overwriting this. And C, forbids some unsafe or error-prone language features. Yeah, so one example of this is you can't set properties on primitives. And when I talk about primitives, these are, strings, numbers, booleans, etc. And this is opposed to objects where you can set properties on them. But yeah, if you say hello, which is a primitive, and you try to set a property on it, equals goodbye, it's going to throw a type error. So we don't like sloppy mode. We like using useStrict so that these things that would normally be just ignored, the JavaScript actually throws an error and alerts you of it. And this helps us not have errors in our code and be more aware of them. All right, next question. We shouldn't use innerHTML for anything other than clearing content. A, true, or B, false? The answer is true. So we really want to use document.createElement over innerHTML. And the reason why is kind of tied back into like useStrict, where it's a little sloppy, When you set the innerHTML, what you're doing is you're basically clearing out anything that this div element had inside of it, and you're setting it. You have to build up this HTML in your JavaScript. And this goes back to where we want to separate out our HTML and JavaScript, where, here we're like, okay, we gotta like include the tags, we gotta, make sure that it's properly structured for it to actually show up within the inner HTML of the div. And let's say, for example, the div actually had another image, and what you did is you just got rid of that image. Let's say it had a dog picture. Let's see, can I draw a dog? All right, that's a dog picture. Let's say the div had a dog picture, and you just cleared it out, and now it has a cat picture instead. The superior pet, in my opinion, but whatever, I digress. Versus if you're using document.createElement and you're setting all the properties line by line, and then you're appending it, it's not gonna get rid of that dog picture. It's still gonna be there. God, these pictures are getting worse and worse. But now it also has a cat picture. So avoid using innerHTML unless you're clearing out. So let's say they had these 2 pictures and you just want to get rid of them. You can do div.innerHTML equals empty string. Right, next question. Which of the following is false about event listeners? A, can add multiple event listeners to one element. B, can have multiple events that you're listening to for one element. C, once you add them, you can't remove them. Or D, mouse over and key down are examples of events you can listen for. And yes, the answer is C. You can absolutely remove event listeners, and this is actually a really good thing, because sometimes you just want to let someone press a button once and then, get rid of the button, or get rid of the event listener associated with that button. So let's go through all A, B, and D. So can add multiple event listeners to one button. Yeah, this is true. So, sometimes you might see within web pages, you have different elements for if you press on a button versus if you hover on it. Like sometimes I see buttons will change color if you hover it. So it wants you to like see that you actually interacted with the button, and then if you press it, it'll do some sort of thing. Those are two different event listeners for one element, where the element is the button. B can have multiple events that you're listening to for one element. Sorry, I might have switched these two. So it can have multiple events you're listening to for one element. This is true. So like for example, mouse over or like on click. Those are two events you can listen to. And then A, multiple event listeners. So you could have a button do more than one thing. So you could say on click, you want to handle the click, and then you could also make a similar add event listener on click, where maybe it like logs something, right? You can have multiple of these. It doesn't matter. We established C is incorrect, and then D, mouse over and key down are examples of events you can listen to. This is correct. There's a whole list of them. You can search it up if you want to know what other events you can have your event listeners listen to.